Mexico right now, where you've got a system that still has all of the trappings of democracy, but you have a leader who's actively trying to break them down. Now, the people are pushing back, and the other power centers of pushing back. And in Mexico, very important here, they have term limits. So we really only have another year, year and a half of AMLO before we get someone else in. So I'm not hugely concerned. In the case of Turkey, Erdogan totally bungled the earthquake recovery. And that, even odds, is going to cost him his job, because looks like we are going to have a national unity candidate running against him. And in a relatively free and relatively fair election, he will lose. Then we got to worry about the new guy, because, we don't know a lot about him and he's never been in office before. But these systems are, for the first time, seeing the free world willing to use economic and security tools against them. That is new. One of the tenets of globalization was the idea that in time, economic growth and integration will force all these systems to move for democracies. And throughout the 90s and the 2000s, there was a lot of reason to think that that was true. And then it flipped in the 2010s. We're now seeing that if the West and the free world decide to weaponize what they have, they can really tear some stuff up. And so I'm not sure we're getting into the Biden administration's idea of the autocracies versus democracies, and it's a fight to the end. Way too soon to say that that's how it's going to go. But at a minimum, there's a lot of serious thinking going on. And you can see very easily the difference between the authoritarian systems, your Mexicos, your Indias, your Turkeys, and your dictatorial systems, your Russias and your Chinas, where the decision-making cannot happen anymore because the information flows to the guy at the top have broken down. In the other cases, you may have egotistical leaders that don't like to hear things they don't want to hear, but they're still hearing it. And so there's a degree of awareness, there's a degree of plurality that does not exist in places like Beijing or Moscow.
Doesn't that economic weaponization and willingness to use it, won't that just prompt people to find an alternative?
Well, the problem is there really isn't one. The United States controls the ocean, and if push ever really does come to shove, that's the end of international trade for that country. The United States plus Europe plus Japan is 80% of all financial heft in the wider world, and roughly 2/3 of global consumption. So if you do want to make a go of it, free of these pesky constraints, you have to work with what's left. And what's left is largely dependent upon what you're trying to cut out. So there will always be a question of whether or not the free world is dedicated and willing to put the shoulder into it. And it's now clear that there are certain lines that if you cross, the West is. So it's a calculus. It's economic growth. What pace do you feel that is necessary? Because you're never going to be able to really insulate yourself. It's a question of tolerance.
So we have this supply chain situation, which economically I think is really important. And this is sort of something that we now understand a year into this conflict. We have this supply chain reshoring or disruption that seems to it's going to present a problem regardless of whether we see a resolution in Ukraine. The map's been redrawn. How much this is happening at the same time we have central banks raising interest rates, we have inflation. How damaging will this be? I mean, what are the implications for the global economy?
Well, it's going to be massively expensive, but that expense is going to be borne in two ways. So you're going to have places like the United States that are going to have to roughly double the size of their industrial plant in an environment of more expensive capital and more expensive labor. That is going to be hugely inflationary. So my estimate is 9 to 15% for the next 5 years. That assumes we actually build out the industrial plant. If we fail to do that, we're probably going to have similar inflation rates, but at the end of it, we will have product shortages of every type because we have failed to build out the industrial plant. So for us, there's not a lot of choice. You might as well get the growth that goes with it. And when I say 9 to 15% inflation, keep in mind that this is to build out a supply chain system that is in North America, that serves North America, that uses North America resources and finance, and is simpler and shorter and closer to the end consumer. This is a growth play, not an inflation threat. Inflation is the side effect of what will be the fastest growth in the country's history. This is a good story. But if you are a country that has dominated part of the supply system before, now you have all this stranded industrial plant that doesn't have a consumer, or maybe doesn't even have the raw materials necessary to make it work in the first place. There you get a mix of inflation and deflation. The most destructive combination you can possibly get as you have shortages or overproduction, sometimes even in the same sector. And that is where you think of a Great Depression as perhaps the best case outcome.
And who's most at risk for that?
China is absolutely the top of that list.
What about Japan?
Japan is an interesting case because, you know, the Japanese get a lot of crap for having 0% growth for 30 years now. But they've seen all of this coming, the demographic implosion, the rise of China, the fall of China. And so they took proactive steps over the last 30 years to get ahead of it. Now, that cost them economic growth, but they would forward position a lot of their industrial plant in countries with better demographic profiles and more local consumption. And that has allowed them to, I don't want to say skate by and ignore these issues, but they've pre-positioned for it. So they've moved a huge amount of industrial plant into Southeast Asia and especially the United States. And they're now integrating with other younger countries in a way that preserves their economic functionality. Now, this is still the world's oldest demographic structure, and they are not aging all that gracefully. But they've even taken some steps there between encouragement for young people to form families on one side, and the advancement of robotics on the other. They actually now have a higher birth rate than China, Korea, or Taiwan.
Wow, I don't think a lot of people realize that because we always think of Japan as the aging society.
Yeah, I don't mean to suggest that their birth rate is high, but I'm just saying that they've taken some steps to mitigate a lot of this, and they are no longer a massively export-driven economy. They've managed to relocate a lot of the stuff to the other side of tariff barriers.
Couldn't China just do that?
It's an issue of scale. Chinese would have to do it to an order of magnitude or order of three, factor of three more. And they would have to also do what the Japanese did, which is roll over and show the Americans your belly. I remember that when Abe, former Japanese Prime Minister Abe, came to the United States, he was forced to accept a insulting trade deal in order to get this sort of integration. But it worked. And then there's the time issue. The Chinese have been working on this since the late 80s.
Yeah, and if anything, rather than friendlier relations, it seems to be swinging the other way right now.
Yeah.
So as we look out, two broad sort of questions to end with: what's the greatest geopolitical risk that's underappreciated right now?
Oh, that's absolutely Mexico. If AMLO really does torch Mexican democracy, it's going to be much more difficult for the United States to maintain a constructive relationship. Or if the Jalisco New Generation cartel does succeed in breaking north of the border. You know, this is a drug cartel that kind of exists in Americans' minds in the right way. Until now, the dominant cartel, the Sinaloa, has been a corporate entity. They think of drug running as a business and violence as a means to an end, not an end. Jalisco New Generation is the opposite. It's a gang that just happens to run drugs. And if they cross into the United States, they will go on a violent spree that will force the Americans to revisit all things Mexico and drugs.